Good morning and welcome to Artifact Live, where we look at the science and art of storytelling. My name is Scott McArthur. Thank you very much for being patient with us. Last week, well, what can you say about last week? Everything that could go wrong went wrong for me and my guest. It was basically my internet connection went down, and then there was a problem with Restream, which is the software that I use for this broadcast. So really sorry, but my regular viewers were really gentle on me. So thank you very much for the feedback. It wasn't funny. I actually had a very important keynote to write for today, actually, and it was one that I had to pre-record. And can you imagine the sweat that was running down my back because I had no internet? A lot of the software I use for editing is online, so it was a terrifying experience. Anyway, so there's been quite a lot happened in the last 2 weeks since we were last on. If you remember the last time, I thought the show was outstanding, the one we had with Marcus, where we talked about social change and storytelling. And I think Marcus opened the door on a new way of presenting some of these programs, where we're going to look at some of the really, really practical things we can do with storytelling. And we'll do a little bit of that today, but I'm also thinking about what we can do next with that. And I think we're going to have my friendly vet friend back on again to talk about how he uses storytelling with actual, not his patients, but with their owners. So it's quite interesting. But we'll get back to that another time. That'll probably be next week. It might be the following week. We've also, we've also started a shop, an online shop, where, as you know, I've said before that we are very grateful for the support. And a couple of people have asked me, could you make some merch? I'm not allowed to call it merchandise anymore because apparently it's not the cool thing to say. So we've made some merch. We've got T-shirts, we've got face masks, we've got laptop bags, we've got stickers, we've got badges, or you name it, we've got it. And I'll put that on the screen later on after my guest has left because I don't want to delay this any longer. But really excited about it. I've never done anything like that before, so that's something else that I'm testing out, testing the software. To this week, we're going to talk to Ashok in a minute. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you another one of my stories, which is, I've never told it before. It's quite odd I've never told it before because it's certainly one I tell in my family, but I've never told it publicly before. But today we're going to be talking about the brain and how it works, etc. And I've had a little bit of experience in this field as a researcher, not a lot, but a little bit. And when I was working in the pathology department in Edinburgh University, we did some work on what they call morphology, which is basically the structure of things. And we had these big fancy microscopes and big fancy things called macrotomes, which are a way of cutting tissue. And we were asked to do a little study of 50 human brains, looking at a particular type of human brain in a particular state. So I got quite proficient at working with brain tissue, but one day something happened that I might not be here if I hadn't been quick on my feet. My job at the time was to go, one of my jobs at the time was to go every morning to the mortuary. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into the detail of this, but I had to go to the mortuary. And I had to take the tissue from the specimens, human specimens. And I usually took cervical, lumbar spine and knee joints. And I got quite good at that. But then the technicians were taking the brains out. It was too technical for me, too difficult for me at first, certainly. And the very, very first time I did it, we picked the brain up, and it was in a box, and I sat it at the side. And my professor arrived. I've mentioned him before, Diggle Gardner, and we'd taken out a knee joint, the knee joints, and they were in these orange bags that we used in the pathology department. And we just won some money about 3 months earlier for a grant to buy a diamond saw. It's a band saw. Now, these things, you might think, why on earth are you buying a saw? Well, bones are like wood. You know, saws are the best way to cut them up, certainly initially. And what we always used to do was we would saw them down the middle and open them up and then take an x-ray. We'd do an x-ray beforehand, cut them in half, and then do another x-ray just to look inside the bone to see what was there. This week, the x-ray machine was broken. Now, this was so out of character for me and Dougal that we were really precise in you had to be. I mean, it's another story I'll tell some other time about the scientific method, but you have to do things the same every time. But we didn't this day because the x-ray machine was broken. It's an x-ray box. So we got the knee joint, we set it on there was a clamp on the bandsaw, and you just straight through the middle of it. So we did the first one, no problem at all. I was standing to Dougal's right, and he was doing the cutting, and then one of the technicians was dealing with the bone dust that you get, and he got the second joint, and he went, bzz, and inside this knee joint was a metal plate. Because we hadn't x-rayed it, we didn't know it was there. It hit the bandsaw. Now, this is a very expensive bandsaw. It snapped the bandsaw, the saw itself, and then it got caught in the little thing at the top, little cog at the top, and it started to spin. Now, if you imagine a bandsaw is going really quickly, and that saw started to, there's a Scottish word here, wheech, round the room like this, and the three of us had to dive onto the ground and hope that this thing didn't come down and cut us, because it would have sliced us in bits. Fortunately, there wasn't an emergency alarm, and the technician had his foot. His name was Bob, and Bob got his foot, and he reached up with his foot and pressed the alarm. The alarm went off, and because of that, all the electricity gets cut off, and we didn't get cut in bits. So that's my first ever experience. The first day I'd collected brain tissue, Ashok, I'll talk to you that in a minute. That happened to me. It was absolutely terrifying. So there's a lesson: always X-ray tissue before you put it in a bandsaw. So anyway, that was my experience. The very first time I worked with brains, and incidentally, what we did was we had these wonderful things where we used to. There's a bit of a process. You would take some of the water out of the brain by using a sucrose solution, and then you would cut it up with a very sharp knife. Then you would put it in a thing called a frozen macrotome and cut these lovely little slices. And then we used to look at it under a very special type of microscope. But that's for another day. But today, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Ashok to the show. I'm going to ask him to introduce himself in a sec. This is we've only just met one another about a month ago through a mutual friend, and we had a chat on the phone just to say hello, and boy, did we get on. There's quite a lot of similarities in our career. He stuck at the science, I didn't. So I'm really jealous on that front. But let me get Ashok onto the screen. Here we go, Ashok. Ashok, hello.
Good morning, Scott. How are you?
Welcome to the show. Thank you ever so much for joining me. I'm absolutely delighted that you said yes when I asked you. Have you ever experienced an out-of-control bandsaw?
No, I'm a klutz, so if I encountered one of those, I probably wouldn't be here right now.
Okay, so it's Dr Ashok Jansari. Is that how you say your name? Is that right, Jansari?
Yes, yes.
So tell our viewers what it is you do, Ashok, please.
I'm a cognitive neuropsychologist, and what that means is that I do research on people with brain damage to try to understand how our functions work. So effectively, it's looking at damaged systems to work out how intact systems work. So an example would be that one of my main areas is memory and amnesia. So I study people with memory disorders and dementia as well, which is one memory disorder of many, to try to understand what that tells us about the person's memory disorder, but also we use it as a mirror onto ourselves to understand what that tells us about our memory. Another example is that I work with people with a rare disorder called prosopagnosia, where they can't recognize once familiar faces. So they can walk past their wife or their child in the street and not know who they are from their face. And I studied these people to try to understand, how do you and I recognize faces? So that's my main thing. I teach about it and try to develop rehabilitation.
Okay. Is that the same field Oliver Sacks worked in? Same disease?
It's related. Oliver Sacks was a neurologist, so he was a medically trained doctor who worked more on the treatment side of things. So he didn't work scientifically in research, but there are links. And we've got very similarly named papers, because Oliver Sacks wrote that famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and I wrote a paper entitled The Man Who Mistook His Neuropsychologist for a Pop Star.
I love it. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. I think if people haven't heard of Oliver Sacks, I think he's certainly one of the better writers in that particular space. And I don't know if you've heard Ashok, but they're actually making that famous book into a movie at the moment.
Yes, and did you know there's even an opera of it? I've seen an opera.
Is that?
Yeah, there is an opera, and I've seen it.
I didn't know that.
It was in French, so I had to assume some knowledge.
Okay, I think that would be hard enough for most people in English. Never mind listening
quite. Yes.
Yeah. So what was your paper about then, with this sort of riffing off the title of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat?
It was because I had this patient who can't recognize faces following an awful brain hemorrhage which nearly killed him, and thankfully he survived. But after regaining consciousness and coming back to physical fitness, all of the main problems that he had initially went, but he's left with one profound problem, which is that he can't recognize faces. And so he couldn't recognize the woman in the chair next to his bed crying, or the little people running around the bed, and it was his wife and his grandchildren. So I started working with him scientifically to try to understand what that tells us about our face recognition. Now, during a test that we were doing, we put some photographs of his family members, some famous people, the neuropsychologist who referred him to me, and also a picture of myself into the mix. And this was because we wanted to see whether he recognized us consciously or unconsciously as well. And I wasn't there on the day of the testing. My student Scott was doing it, another Scott. And he came to my photograph, and the question was, do you recognize this person, yes or no? And David, my patient, said, yes, I do. So Scott said, who is it? And he said, it's George Michael. And Scott, I trained him quite professionally, so he didn't laugh his head off. He said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you? He said, 10 out of 10, that's George Michael. Good. Now, the reason is that it wasn't a guess, a complete stupid guess. I'm a bit more hirsute thanks to COVID and can't be bothered to shave. But I used to have a pencil goatee moustache, and I used to wear a gold earring. Now, the thing is that, I mean, I was asked once in a bar in Los Angeles whether I was George Michael while Careless Whispers was playing, which is another weird story. But so what? And my 5-year-old nieces used to jump up and down when George Michael came on TV. Now, the thing is that these aren't mad people. I've got brown skin. George Michael was Greek. I had a goatee beard. I had a gold earring. Now, what that shows us is that these people with prosopagnosia can see. They're not blind. There's this awful term I don't like in the literature, face blindness. And face blindness implies that they can't see this. But they can. But they can't add it up in the way that you can recognize me, I can recognize you. And what that tells us is something quite profound about face recognition. When you look at this, you're using a certain type of visual processing where you add up all the different bits like a visual jigsaw. So you see the handle, you see it's in my hand, and you think, well, that's probably a mug. Now, we don't think that we use that type of visual jigsaw to recognize human faces. We're actually seeing a gestalt, a whole. And when that system, that really specially dedicated system that's been laid down by evolution breaks down, what happens is that a patient like David has to go back to this system and starts adding up goatee beard, brown skin, gold earring, and thinks, these bloody psychologists are always showing me famous people's faces. Who do I know who's got a goatee beard, gold earring, and brown skin, adds 2 and 2 together and gets a banana, or George Michael in this case. Hence the title of the paper, because the title of the paper is a clue into how we investigate prosopagnosia.
Very good. And I mean, that's terrific. And it must be hellish to live with that. I mean, that must be very difficult for the patient to have to. Is there a way you can help, or is it something you just have to understand? Is it?
Prosopagnosia is quite rare. I should point out that some of your viewers might have prosopagnosia, because there are 2 different types of prosopagnosia. There's the very rare one that David had, which is acquired through brain damage. And the statistics on that are so difficult to find that you can't even put a number on it. A neuropsychologist could spend their whole career and not meet a patient with acquired prosopagnosia because it's that rare. And I've created a niche in knowing that area. But there is another variant called developmental prosopagnosia, which is where people have always had it without brain damage. And we think that about 1 in 50 people have it.
Oh,
So in a school of 300 people, 6 of those kids will have prosopagnosia. And there are some famous people who've started admitting that they have difficulty with recognizing faces. Duncan Ballantyne of Dragon's Den, Jane Goodall, the primatologist. Apparently, Stephen Fry has difficulties. Oliver Sacks himself, before he passed away, admitted that he had difficulties with faces. So what we're seeing is that this problem is much more prevalent than we think. It's just that we tend to develop ways of recognizing people from their voice, their clothing, hairstyles, body jewelry, etc. And that's what these people tend to use. The problem is that they need to be quite distinctive to be able to recognize someone. You can't say blue shirt, therefore Ashok, because other men wear blue shirts as well.
Yes.
So actually, it's quite difficult to help. So it's more about finding strategies around it, but also with the patients I've worked with, it tends to be about being open to telling people that I have this problem. So if I see you outside this meeting room, I might not recognize you. And so part of it is something that I'm getting into, which is neurodiversity, which is just being open about these differences that we all have.
I mean, that's, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought we'd get to that today, but that's a fascinating topic because I mean, it's very current, isn't it? I mean, everyone's talking about diversity issues on the macro scale, but you're talking about it at the individual scale. That's really interesting, Ashok. What about one thing I've never done that you have done wonderfully is you currently lead a research team. I was always one of the researchers. I was never the guy in charge, if you like. How could you explain to people how it is you go about researching an area like this? You know, how do you choose the topics? How do you set your PhD students off on the topic? Because it's an area that's never spoken about in the media. I mean, people say, "Oh, science says," and people very rarely understand what actually that involves. Would you mind just? I know it's a bit science 101, Ashok, but people don't know it. So, would you mind just telling us how you do it?
I think it's actually a really good question because as children, we have ideas of what being a bus driver or an engineer or a lawyer is because we see those things on TV. But being a scientist is this kind of weird term which effectively implies geeky glasses and a white lab coat. That's it. And I have undergraduate students who don't know what a PhD entails. I've even had a friend who had a PhD who didn't yet have a lecturing post, who said, when I helped her get this lecturing post, she said, "But how do I know what research I have to do?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, how do I work out what research I do?" And I said, "You do whatever you want." And that's one of the beauties of science and the freedom within an academic post like mine, which is that effectively I have 3 jobs. One is that I have to teach, which is the central aspect of what I do. I lecture undergraduates, master's students, and PhD students. The other is a second one is administration. So I help run the department. I have certain administrative duties such as international recruitment or looking after PhD students. And then whatever time is left over is my research time. Now, generally speaking, you do what you want. Now, as long as I don't start studying Scandinavian poetry in a psychology department, they're happy for me to do what I want, as long as it's within the remit of what my department does. And it allows you this wonderful kind of breathing of what am I interested in? So I've always been a weird jack of all trades and ace of absolutely nothing, which is that one of the ways through academia is finding a niche and going straight down it and kind of getting more and more into it. So you become the world leader in that field. And I've always felt that's not for me. I'm a bit of a social butterfly, and in my research, I'm like that as well, because I find it all really interesting. Now, for this, I have my amazing, amazing undergraduate supervisor from Cambridge, Professor Rosalind McArthur, to thank, because she's the person who switched me into this field that I'd never even heard of. And she had such passion for so many different aspects of brain damage that one week we'd be talking about people who couldn't tell you that that meowing animal was a cat, or that this is a piece of fruit. The next week she'd be telling us about someone who could tell you what happened 20 years ago, but not what happened 20 minutes ago. And then another week should be telling us about people who had interesting face recognition disorders. And I thought, oh my God, I love this, but I can't narrow down to one area. And in fact, it was a problem for my career at one point, which is that I was doing the thing that you're not supposed to do, which is stay broad. Yes. And it did become problematic at one point, because as you'll know from your own experience, labs tend to specialize.
Yeah.
And so I was doing something that doesn't really get you far quickly. But I decided, no, it has to interest me. And I'm interested in face recognition. I'm interested in memory. I'm interested in something called executive functions, which is how the front of the brain develops during childhood and adolescence and into early adulthood, and which then starts deteriorating as we get older, and which is implicated in all of the developmental disorders. It's implicated in various psychiatric disorders. It's implicated in criminality. It's implicated in dementia, with some of the work that's coming out now about how repeated head injuries through sports predispose you to dementia. So I just decided I'm not going to stick to one area. I'm going to stay broad. But that's actually been a good strength. And interestingly, it helps with the storytelling. By having experience in a number of different areas, I can have a kind of overview of neuropsychology, which I might not have if I've just specialized in one area. So in terms of how to set a PhD student going, it's always a conversation with that student. What do you find interesting? Because ultimately, if the student is working full time, they're going to spend 3 years on this thing, so they better enjoy it. So the first thing is, what are you interested in? Why are you interested in it? And so it's really a conversation between me and that student. So Claudia, my student, is interested in face recognition, so we're working on faces. Terry, my PhD student, is interested in memory, and he's developed this amazing test that we think might be able to pick up preclinical signs of dementia. So that's Terry's thing. And then I've got other students working on looking at whether head injuries during childhood might be a contributory role to later criminality and reoffending. So each of them is interested in a different area, and I'm able to guide them and help them pursue their interests, if that answers your question.
It does beautifully. Thank you. I mean, it is such a lovely thing to have that academic freedom to follow your intellectual nose, I guess, and have clever people to help bring that to life. It must be an incredibly satisfying role to have, Ashok.
It is, and sometimes I kind of consider myself a bit of like a Sherlock Holmes with the deer stalker, and thinking, okay, we close our eyes, we can have an image of what we've just seen. Or if I tell you to imagine your children's faces, you would be able to bring your children's faces to your mind's eye. There are people who can't do that. And as you know, I've been giving these free talks during lockdown online. And I thought, I'll give a talk on that. So basically, I followed my interest, which is, this is an interesting area. Why don't I give a talk on it?
Yes.
And of course, I had to then learn about it and get to a point where I could speak for an hour to a global audience. Yes. I did it. And guess what happened? We are flooded with people saying, oh, my God, thank you for bringing some attention to this area, which no one talks about and which I've suffered from all my life. And it's really good that scientists are working in this area. And suddenly, like that, I developed a new research area. So my wonderful PhD student, Claudia, and I are basically starting the Goldsmiths Aphantasia Research Group, and we're getting people to write to us if they have any difficulties in mental imaging, with their dreaming, etc. And we've started a new area simply because we're interested in it.
Good Lord. Right. Now that I've put your channel. I'll put it back on. Actually, that's your YouTube channel. Now I love it. I've only watched. I have to confess, I've only watched your last one, but I've looked at the others. They all look interesting to me. So I would recommend it, guys. If you want to listen to somebody who you can already tell Ashok's an interesting chap, but his scientific talks are excellent. And I believe we were chatting just quickly beforehand. You're doing your next one on mindfulness.
Mindfulness meditation, yes.
Right. And do you practice?
Yes, I have actually done a course, and I practice, and I really cannot recommend it enough. What I will be doing in the talk is trying to demystify it, because meditation has got a really kind of odd persona in the public image.
Yes.
And I worked as a science journalist very briefly for a media fellowship for the Irish Times. And I wrote a piece about mindfulness, and I entitled it, "Did you ever think that chewing a raisin would help you with chronic pain?" And the reason for that is that there's this 8-week course, the 8-week course of mindfulness meditation that's been developed, which starts off with people being given a raisin to chew. And that's their journey into how often we tend to not experience the current moment. So if you're given a raisin to chew, most people chew it, swallow it, and don't even remember anything about it. And that's the inroad into the fact that by doing that, we're either living in the past and worrying about something that has already gone and playing it over and over again in our heads, or we're worrying about the future and anxious about something that hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
And mindfulness is this grounding about how to come back to the current moment. And so what I said in that article is that when you mention the word mindfulness or meditation, most people think of saffron robes, joss sticks, and chanting. Yes. And mindfulness meditation is none of those things. I've never chanted. I mean, I'm from a Hindu background, so I've lit joss sticks, but not because of my mindfulness meditation. And so mindfulness is this amazing, amazing skill. It is a skill, and it's a protective skill. One of the things I'll be talking about is the fact that mindfulness meditation might be an incredible tool for young people to cope with the horrors of adolescence and the growing pains of adolescence. But it's also been shown to be protective against the thinning of the brain that happens as we get older. So it's been shown that older people who've meditated continuously for quite a while, the front of the brain, which is the part of the brain that starts thinning first, because that's happening. Unfortunately, Scott, as you know, our brain cells are dying all the time. It's just that rate of dying starts increasing with age. And as we get to past, say, 60, that really accelerates. It's been shown that with mindfulness meditation, that acceleration is decreased. So mindfulness meditation seems to protect us from some of the ravages that happen to the brain, and it protects us from emotional challenges. It's been shown to improve your immune system. So mindfulness is amazing. I can't recommend it enough.
It's something that it is much misunderstood, isn't it? And there is quite a lot of how do I put this without offending anybody? Woo-woo, nonsense around it. But the science is becoming increasingly convincing that there is a real effect. And I mean, I said to you, I've been practicing for the best part of 30 years now, and I don't think I could do without it anymore. It's become part of my daily routine, Ashok. So even when I'm exhausted, I love it. I absolutely love it.
It's really interesting you say that, Scott, because recently, with the pandemic and working from home, my work days have increased to stupid hours. And I actually feel privileged that I can work for that many hours because I don't have to, commute and all that sort of thing. But exhaustion happens. You can be passionate about something, but exhaustion happens. And what I've been finding is that I might lie down on the sofa at about 5 o'clock, having already done about 9-10 hours of work, and I will start my what's called the body scan, which is one of the techniques you learn in mindfulness. And it's such a refreshing way to come back to your physical self and just come back to a point of equilibrium. And then I can do another 3 hours work after that. So like you, I wonder what my life would be without mindfulness.
Yes. It's like I often say to people, honestly, very similar. I often say to people, have you ever smoked? I've never smoked, well, nothing legal anyway, but it's almost like a cigarette break for me. You know, I use the body scan in the morning, and then a couple of times during the day, I do little micro meditative pauses, and I find it incredible. And when I introduce it to some of my students, Ashok, and what I say to them is, you can meditate to anything. You know, you can meditate reading a book, you can meditate when you're making love, you can meditate listening to music. You know, there's all sorts of ways you can do it. And it always surprises people, because just like you described at the beginning, it's not all bells, joss sticks. It's just not like that. Now,
and I bet you, sorry, I just wanted to say something there. I bet you've had lots of people who say, no, I can't meditate. And I'd be no good at it. And the thing is that I remember when I was a young idiot and someone said to me, oh, you should try to meditate, because I was going through a rough patch, and someone said, you should meditate. And I said, guess what? Oh, I can't meditate. I'd be no good at it. And what that person said to me was brilliant. The very act of trying to meditate is meditation.
Absolutely.
And the analogy I give, because I think we'll probably come to this later on with science, is analogies. That meditation isn't this thing that you're good at or not. You are. So it's not like I can say I'm a good runner. I can run. I'm not going to win an Olympic medal for it, but the mere act of running makes me a runner. And that's all mindfulness is. Mindfulness is a skill. Everyone cooks a bit. Some people are better cooks than others. And if you practice it, then you can use it wherever you want. And like anything, you can do it a bit more, etc. But the way that I see mindfulness is that it's like going to the gym, where going to the gym is about getting physically fit, either with aerobic exercise, so you can keep going with stamina, or anaerobic exercise with body pumping and all that sort of thing. And that's not because you need it in the gym. You're doing it so that if you're in your everyday life, you need to run for the bus, you've got the stamina to run for the bus. If you need to lift a heavy object to help someone escape something, you've got the physical power to do it. So the act of going to the gym is the practice for the real world. And mindfulness meditation, for me, the act of practicing means that when I feel emotionally challenged because someone has annoyed me, or I'm feeling stressed, I can bring mindfulness to bear on my current moment to allow me not to get stressed. So I think that if people can see that it's simply a skill that you use for getting through some of the difficulties in life, rather than I need to be good at it, I think that if we can change that mindset, then we do very well.
Yeah, I think there are some quite positive signs that it is. I mean, certainly I've been asked to teach school children basic meditation, and I used the raising technique from the Oxford group, so they loved it. They loved it because it's just it's so easy to do, but it is actually very interesting. But so before there's two things that I'd like us to get on to, Ashok. I'd like us to talk about the communication of science, which you've just demonstrated beautifully with that story. I thought that was lovely. And I'd also like us to talk about storytelling. And I know the time is going on already. But just before we do that, I'd like to remind people that if you have a question for either of us, please pop it in the comments. And we've had one, Ashok. I think you can see it over there from DJ Yannick's over on Twitch. Have you a perspective on this? It's quite a long question, and thanks very much for your comment about my blazer. Thank you. This is my speaking jacket. Have you any perspective on this question at all?
I can't see the question yet.
I'll read it to you. It's okay, I can read it to you. It says, blah, 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 blah. My question to Ashok is, what are your thoughts on the recent findings on Hawking radiation? And how do you think going forward it will affect our daily lives in relation to taking an hour out to meditate? Gosh.
Unfortunately, I've heard of Hawking radiation, but I know nothing about it. So I think 0 for 1, the Americans would say, which is that I've struck out with the first question. Sorry.
I'm the same. I've heard of it as well, but I don't know anything about it either. I'm really sorry.
I might even be making it up. Maybe I've never heard of it, but I certainly don't know it.
There's another comment here from Joanne. Hi, Joe. And she asked, my problem with meditation is the lack of quiet.
Right. What I would say to that is that it depends on whether Joanna means that she doesn't have quiet spaces in which she can meditate. Because I've meditated on a busy London tube, and you can meditate and just closing your eyes and the breathing meditation, which is just bring your attention back to, say, your sternum or your nostrils. You just, your mind will wander, what's that person over there saying, or their voice is a bit irritating. All you've got to do is, okay, mind has wandered, bring it back to the sternum. Take the next breath. And then someone says something over there. And literally just coming back. So in a way, being in a noisy place is actually a really good gym workout for your meditation.
Yeah, I think the way I describe that, Ashok, that coming back that Ashok said there, Joe, the coming back to your mind or coming back to your sternum, that is meditation. That is the physical part. That is it. It's the
all it is.
Yeah, and people there is a misconception that meditation is about stilling the mind. It's not. It's about focused attention. So you can. I mean, one of the jokes I tell in one of my keynotes is you can actually meditate to death metal. You know, you can anything you can meditate to, because it is the act of it wandering and coming back. And as Ashok beautifully put there, it's the coming back piece. That's like the muscle that you exercise when you're doing your gym work. I know you do gym work, Joe. So it's like when you exercise your muscles when you're doing your morning gym workout. That thought process is meditation. So. Yeah.
And just to expand that a bit for Joanna, in this 8-week course, you learn lots of different meditations. So you learn this breathing meditation, you learn this body scan, you learn a listening meditation where you're asked to, on your daily walk to the tube or whatever, listen to nature, because we tend to miss the birds chirping, etc. There's an eating meditation, there's a walking meditation, and I'm sure at some point in the future there'll be a death metal meditation.
If not, I'm going to write it.
I think so, yeah. I think you'll be bringing in a whole load of converts if you can do the death metal one.
Yes, it was funny. My guest 2 weeks ago, Ashok, was from Finland, and Finland has more death metal bands than there were bands in the 60s. It's massive in Finland. It's absolutely massive. Even their Eurovision Song Contest entrants for the last 3 years have been death metal bands.
Yes.
It's a terrible racket, but I quite like it.
So you could basically convert a whole country to mindfulness by developing the death metal.
Yeah, I found my niche.
Yes, and then you can get the merch out there.
Yes, absolutely. So can I, gosh, how are you doing for time, Ashok? Have we got you for another 20 minutes?
I've been gone for 3 days. I enjoyed the conversation. So.
This is fascinating. Let's talk specifically about storytelling. This show, I'll just give you a little context to Ashok. This show was developed because I was trying to help people make progress. I was trying to help people change. I was trying to help people, do corporate transformations. And I realized that although facts tell, it's the stories that sell. It's and that's why we need to talk about the communication of science, isn't it? We'll part that for a minute. But so what is it about story, you think, that our brains have been drawn to since before we had language? And, you know, we're all fascinated by story. We've spent lockdown immersed in, you know, everyone's talking about Netflix and binging and about, you know, all the rest of it. What is it about story from a perspective of a neuroscientist?
According to one of my wonderful students, Francesco Innocenti, who's got a lovely YouTube channel in which he reviews popular science books. There's a book by Will Storr, who you probably know of already, called The Science of Storytelling. And in that, he talks about how, as humans, we're very curious. And that, I think, is probably the key to it. Now, Chris Packham has got this wonderful show on at the moment called Animal Einsteins, and it's about the intelligence of animals. And what you see is that intelligence is a really difficult concept to define and therefore measure. But what you can see is that some animals are more curious than others. Now, you and I, we're talking about things like death metal meditation that we have never done, and yet we're curious about it. So as a species, we're able to do this thing, which we don't know whether other animals can do it, which is just cogitate and think about stuff. And that curiosity, I think, is the central piece. Now, I could throw a whole load of facts at you, or I can weave it into a story. And we all know how, you know, Hollywood is built on storytelling. Draw someone into a romance or a thriller or whatever. So literature wouldn't exist, and films, dramas, plays, operas, etc. wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the fact that we actually like a starting, a middle, and an end. And so that kind of exploration of a curiousness, I think, is what helps storytelling. I've been watching a BBC4 series called, I think it's Raiders of the Lost Past, with a historian looking at various finds from the past. And one of them was, I think it's called the Osgard ship, which is the most intact Viking ship ever found. And the way that she was bringing us into this thing wasn't, here's a ship, it was built at this time, these were the Vikings, etc. She brought it in as a story, and she used science to help this story. But in a way, she was giving us history and science by trying to tell us a story. And I think that a story effectively gives us this narrative, which we can then add our details to. And that I use stories in my teaching all the time, because I'm trying to create a path which is a question at the beginning, and I'm effectively answering the question at the end. One of my talks is called The Life of Brian, and in that I analogize the 3,000-year history since the word brain was first written down by an Egyptian scribe as a hieroglyphic into a 30-year-old man called Brian. And I contextualize different achievements in the physical sciences, in astronomy, chemistry, biology, etc., against what we know about Brian, the brain. And by doing that, I'm giving a framework, whereas I could say 3,000 years ago this happened, 150 years ago this happened. But those cold facts make it more difficult for the larger audience to get involved. And I think for me, in public communication, the important person is the person who you wouldn't ordinarily speak to. The ones who are interested in the brain, they're going to find a way to understand this anyway. But I feel that my job is to speak to that person who would never have thought of listening to a neuropsychologist give a talk, who then says, oh my God, there is something interesting here. So I see my job as effectively feeding the curiosity of that person by speaking to them in a language that they will find accessible.
That takes me to a topic I know we both feel quite passionately about, and that is the communication of science. And you mentioned Chris Packham, who I absolutely adore. I think he's fantastic. He would probably like the death metal as well, because he likes punk rock.
Oh, he does, yes. He mentioned Jesus and Mary Chain and the other day.
But there's an odd thing with this that I've never really understood. I mean, my great hero is Carl Sagan. And do you know, I was 20 miles from Carl Sagan in 1985. I would have loved, I wish, if I had known he was giving a lecture in Glasgow when I was a student, I could have been there. I could have been there, you know, and it's like, oh, God.
I was within about 20 feet of Stephen Hawking, so that's the closest I've got to Hawking radiation.
Excellent. But the interesting thing about Sagan, not so much Hawking, but definitely Packham, is that they're quite often looked down upon by certain people in the scientific community. It is bizarre. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, why?
I think that there is an aspect within the scientific fraternity which is very aloof and which wants to maintain the barriers, and I've literally never ever understood that. So I hope it's okay for me to use this word, but I remember that when I first started doing bits of TV work, the phrase was media whore, and it was as if there was something dirty about speaking to the outside world. And this is no wonder there's all these stereotypes of people stuck in their ivory towers and stuff like that. And I studied at one of the ivory towers. I studied at Cambridge, but the thing is that some of the lectures I enjoyed most were the history and philosophy of science, and the way it was told was amazing and accessible. So not everyone in Cambridge is like that, but some people in academia, and they can be at the most mediocre university, seem to want to keep those barriers. And I see academics who do that. They create a barrier between them and their students. There's a them and us. I say to my students that there's no difference between me and them. The only difference is that I've been in the game longer than them. And some of my students, and Francesco is one of them, Francesco is the most gifted student I've ever taught in my 25-year career. Francesco is going to go beyond me. I know that. And my job is to help Francesco get to where he can get to. And so for me, this thing where science doesn't like the Chris Packhams, etc., who are talking to the media, I just think that's disgusting, because ultimately he's bringing people, young people, into science that otherwise would never come here. And so I've never understood it.
Yes, very odd. Joanne's saying she went to dinner with Richard Dawkins.
So did I. Oh. we wanted the same dinner, were we, Joanna? I shared a taxi back from this dinner with him, and it was rather interesting because we were both born in Nairobi. I mean, who'd have thunk it? That really? Richard Dawkins and we were both born in the same city. Yes, he was born in Nairobi.
Yeah, even Richard. I mean, Richard sometimes asks for it, but he does get quite a lot of flack from obviously the public because he's very contentious, deliberately so. But he also gets it from the scientific community sometimes. It's
that, and I hate the phrase that dumbing down. Yeah, there are some people who dumb down science, and I think you and I are both on the same page on that. That we don't like science being abused by people outside science, or people who are using a bit of science to effectively sell snake oil to the outside world. That I don't like. But I don't think that simplifying science to make it accessible is dumbing down. That's like saying that an artist who's explaining what art is to young people is dumbing down art. They're not dumbing down art. They're trying to make us understand why Picasso is important. I don't think that's a dumbing down. And it's that kind of thing where I think, what is it about the scientists? And there's something about that purist nature, and you have to talk about it in these ways, and you can't only say part of it, you've got to say all of it. I think that's a kind of Darwinian dodo. I mean, that's the type of scientist we just don't need.
Yes, I had an interesting experience with one of the research groups at Oxford, and the professor who runs the particular group had asked me to come along and talk to them about how they communicate their findings. And it was basically Ashok, it was posters. They were going to a conference and they were doing some posters. And I said, I tell you what, why don't you let me come in like a dragon and have a look at the posters and tell you what I think? Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, it was terrible. I mean, and I was very gentle on them. I didn't go full into them, but it was basically, you asked if you could say the word whore. Well, it was dick waving that was going on, and it was really poor dick waving. Yeah. And I tore them to bits very gently, and I said to them, who's the audience? And you know what? Their audience was the professor. They weren't actually thinking about the audience at all. It's absolutely hilarious.
I think you and I are so much on the same page on this. One of my academic roles for the last 6 years has been examining all PhD students at Goldsmiths, and this is after the first year of their PhD. It's a formal exam that they have to do, an oral exam with myself and another person. And I always say to these students that I don't know your area. I'm just tasked with examining you. Yes. The other person is going to be an expert in the area. I want you to treat me as a kind of intelligent but uninformed layperson. Yes. So talk to me, draw me into this. And it's amazing that despite me saying this up front, so few of them do it, because guess what? They're talking to their professors.
Yes.
What I say to my research group and all of my students is that the first thing that you think about when you're writing something is someone outside Sainsbury's carrying 4 heavy shopping bags. And one of my students is called Lindsay, and Lindsay's mum has become famous in my tutorial group because we always say, talk to Lindsay's mum. So Lindsay's mum is carrying her 4 shopping bags outside Sainsbury's or wherever she shops, Fortnum and Mason, whatever, and she wants to go home. Now, unless I can make my stuff about executive functions or prosopagnosia or aphantasia interesting to Lindsay's mum, she wants to go home. And if it starts raining, she's thinking, I don't want to listen to this boring person. No, I've got to make her think there's a reason for me to stay here. And that's what accessibility is about. That's what Chris Packham is doing. Yes. He's not just saying, oh, look, birds sing or birds build nests. He's telling us why we should care about it. And those dick wavers, what they're doing is that they're doing the Emperor's New Clothes stuff.
Yes.
They're using the fancy language to convince their PhD supervisor and the 3 other people in the world who give a damn about that area, fancy language to make that person feel that they're saying clever stuff. I just think that's stupid. In my research team, every Wednesday when we meet, a student will give a talk, or a few students will give individual talks, and we will ask them questions. And then afterwards, we'll have a 5-minute feedback where we talk to them about feedback about what we liked and what we think could be improved. Now, it's now standard in my team that someone will say, that was a bit inaccessible. You didn't explain that terminology to us. You didn't give us a real world example. And what I always say is, get people emotionally involved at the beginning. That why should they care? And it's only when you get people invested in why they should care that people will get drawn in. You can still give them the same information at the end of the day.
Yes,
but you've got to show them why they should even bother listening to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the paper that you wrote here. You see that title, and you go, oh, I'm interested in that. I want to know about that. It catches your imagination. As a member of the public, which I am, I see that and I think, yeah, because I remember that I have to say a couple of papers I've written are terrible. I mean, the headings are incomprehensible, but we're using all the right buzzwords. I'd like to.
It's quite. I was just going to say that you'll find this quite funny. Then every single one of my papers has got a weird title. because I've always been doing this. My first paper from my PhD was things that go bump in your life, and it was about something called the reminiscence bump. But it's got to a point where I actually get consulted by people for a title. So one of my friends, Andrew James, he is a neuropsychologist, a clinician, who had a really bizarre case of someone who had been brought up by a troop of monkeys in the Colombian jungles because she got lost in the jungles as a child. She got rescued from that after about 5 years there, and then many years later was being taken back to Colombia or Costa Rica, I can't remember where, for a documentary about this. And she developed a virus because of some insects there, which created brain damage. And it was a really, it was a legal case, which is now, there's even been TV documentaries about it. And he wanted to talk about this really interesting case. And he said, I know you're really good at titles. What do you think? And I said, call it the Jungle Book of Cognitive Neuropsychology, Dissociating Developmental from Acquired Disorders. Because the Jungle Book of Neuropsychology was about the fact that this woman was brought up in a jungle. We have a developmental issue, which is that this child lost really important years of socializing that a 5-year-old needs. So for 5 years, she wasn't around people and she wasn't learning social stuff, etc. So she had that developmental problem. But then as an adult, she ended up with acquired brain damage. So the Jungle Book of Cognitive Neuropsychology. And at the conference, when he gave his talk, someone said, if there was a prize for best title, you'd get the best prize. And for me, it's about, again, dragging people in rather than a really dry title, which just makes them think, oh, there's another paper. So I think titles and effectively getting people to think about, why should I have a look at this?
I think I'd love us to just do a whole show on what you've just said, because I often coach people who are speakers, and I do honestly exactly the same thing. You know, I did a talk called The Carrot and the Heuristic. You know, and they immediately get it. You know, they immediately go, I'm interested, I'm curious. And they use that word right at the beginning. And yeah, if you say my talk today is about motivating your workforce, you know, it's no use. You know, people don't get it at all. Right. I want to do one last part, because we're over an hour now. Amazingly, I can't believe that's been an hour. A bit like meditation. It felt a bit like time travel there, my friend. I can't talk to somebody who's in the psychology domain, if you like, without talking about the replication crisis.
Yeah.
Now, people watching might not know what that is. I mean, I can explain it, but I think I'd rather, if you don't mind, could you tell or share what that is about? And what I would be interested in is how does psychology recover from it? Because the woo-woo merchant are still selling nonsense based on nonsense from that domain. And it's something that worries me. Maybe I shouldn't worry about it, but I do. But I'd just be interested in your thoughts, Ashok. How do we go forward from here?
Okay, did you want me to explain the replication crisis?
I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Okay, so when we do research in psychology, we're trying to work out things like, how does memory work? What is children's intelligence about, etc. Now, you could try to do, if we're trying to talk about all of the children in the UK, we could test every child in the UK, but that's not feasible. So what we do is, rather than the population, we test a sample. So we might test 100 children and say, these children are representative of the population of children in the UK. And that's what they do with TV ratings and Gallup polls, etc. They take a representative sample and they say, this is our representative sample. And based on our representative sample, we think that 30% of the population do this, etc., etc. Now, in science, we do the same thing. We take a representative sample and then we do our research on them, and we have statistical techniques for working out whether our scientific hypothesis is correct or not. Now, that statistics is based on the fact that we know that we haven't tested the whole world. We know that we've only tested a sample of it. So the statistic is a probability of us being quite sure without being certain. And it's all to do with this philosopher called Karl Popper and to do with falsification, but I won't go there. But basically, when we test these 100 kids, we know that we're not testing all of the children in the UK. So the statistic is we're pretty sure. What replication is about is that if this research had been done properly, there's a really, really, really high probability that if I do it on another 100 kids, I'll get a similar result, and another 100 kids, I'll get a similar result, etc. And replication is basically getting the same findings when you do the thing again and again and again. And the replication crisis in psychology is the fact that there are lots of studies that have been published, some of which have ended up in the public domain as facts,
yes,
which we find out people haven't been able to replicate. So how that happens is not clear, but it's important when a scientist or a student is looking at work to see whether it's the only time it's been shown or whether it's again and again and again and again. And a classic example is neuroimaging. So neuroimaging is all those kind of fancy brain pictures with, little red bits and blue bits, etc. There's a huge replication crisis in neuroimaging. And I've actually got a talk, which is Never Mind the Neurobollocks, which is about some of this stuff. There's a famous paper called The Dead Salmon, and it's about a neuroimaging study where they showed that a dead salmon was having emotional thoughts in a brain scanner. And this is to do with mathematics, etc. So this is the crisis within psychology. And the way that science is moving forward with this is that journals are becoming much more strict about what they'll publish. So, for example, just recently, with a paper that we're publishing on a face recognition test that I've got. If anyone's interested in how good their face recognition is, they should email me and I'll send them some tests to see how good their face memory. So we're publishing a paper about this, and what the journal requested was the test itself. They wanted to see that if they did the test, what would they find? So rather than the kind of gentleman's agreement, which used to be, well, I've written this manuscript and I'm sending it to you, and because I'm a good egg, then you're going to assume that I'm telling the truth. Now they want to actually see the money. In another paper that we're publishing, this is on our test of dementia. And again, this is a really important study. So if anyone's interested, then I'd like them to email me. What the journals are now asking is that we hand over our data. So this is about not taking my word for it that we got a significant finding and that older people are worse or that younger people are this, that, and the other. They want the data so that someone in Boston or in New York or in Papua New Guinea who's interested in this can reanalyze my data to make sure that I haven't been telling porkies. And then the final thing is called open science, and with journals that don't charge for someone to look at the paper. So, for example, yes, hurrah. So my man who mistook his neuropsychologist paper, that is an open source paper which any of your viewers can find. Whereas there are some journals, I won't name them, which charge us to pay to get published within them, and then it ends up being it keeps everything within science. And the thing is that which is the base of what you're talking about, we want to be open and we want to share it. So I think that that's the way science is moving forward, by addressing this, by making science much more open and publicly accountable.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to ask a really cheeky question. T-Rex, should we bring it back or not?
Oh yes, because they look cool.
Yeah, that's what I think as well.
But presumably you meant the band, not the
Oh no, no.
No, I knew you meant, but I just
You're a right
bring them both back.
aren't you? Yeah.
Bring them both back and have a T-Rex off.
Yes. I'm not going to go there. I was going to start talking about that, but better not. That's another show that I do on a Friday night. So Ashok, that has been absolutely fantastic, and incredible storytelling, first class. Well done. I really have enjoyed that, and I think if you're open to it, I'd love to get you back and go deeper into at least two of those topics, because I know my audience are very interested in the sort of communication part of it, the how to get, you know, your your titles of your papers, and how you've pushed that to the lady outside Sainsbury's. That sort of thinking is rare in the industry as well as in science. So I'd love to talk to you about that again if you were open to it. But
it would be my pleasure. I mean, as you can tell, I mean, I'm a bit of a chatterbox, and
yeah.
and I think, you know, we're fortunate that we do a job that we find interesting and which other people find interesting and hopefully useful. And so for me, I actually consider my civic responsibility. I get paid by the taxpayer, and for me, it would be selfish not to share this. So I would love to come back.
Okay, thank you. Now, that would be fantastic. I'll be in touch about that. Now, I've got your email on the screen. Is there anything else you want to tell people about that you'd like them to look at, to see your work? Or
the YouTube channel, and they can find my web pages and my team's web page, which is ARTLab. I don't have the email address here, I'm afraid. Sorry, the URL. But if they look up Ashok's research team, they'll be able to find it. Now, the big study that we're really trying to work on is that we need lots of people to do our memory test, because we're trying to profile memory across the lifespan. Because as I said earlier, the front of the brain is deteriorating as we get older. And we're trying to differentiate normal aging from dementia. And dementia is a time bomb waiting to go off because of the cost of dementia, increased longevity because of healthcare, etc. So we've got people living to older ages, and unfortunately, the dementia can still be there despite physical health. And so we're looking at from 16 years to 100. We want anyone to get in touch. They don't need to have a good or bad memory. Basically, anyone, we want them to get in touch with us. And if anyone works for either an amateur or a professional sports team, then we'd really like to talk to them, because just recently, I think it's the Welsh rugby captain is suing the rugby league or something like that, because at the age of 42, he's been diagnosed with dementia. There's a film called Concussion with Will Smith in it, which is about the true story of a Nigerian doctor who found this pattern of American footballers who were dying in their early 40s who had dementia. And 30 years of this is not good for your head, apparently. And so we're doing research in that. So if anyone works for an amateur or a professional sports team, we'd really like to connect with you, because this is a public service. We're trying to help society learn about the impacts of hitting the head.
Yes, it's certainly something that's been in the media increasingly over the last few weeks, isn't it? It's
it is, yeah.
It's of some significant concern. Well,
yes, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you ever so much. I've loved it.
You're very welcome.
Fantastic.
So have I hope you guys have found it interesting, and I'm happy to answer any questions if people email.
There's Derek's just said, fascinating hour, time well spent. Thank you, Derek. Thank you. We'll definitely see you again. I'll just switch your camera off now. But
before I go, Derek, I just wanted to let your audience know that my next talk will be on Saturday, the 27th of March. It will be cast on Facebook. And if they look up Dr. Ashok Jansari, neuropsychologist on Facebook, they'll see my professional page, and I will be advertising it on there or through my own Facebook pages. And at 5 o'clock on Saturday, the 27th, I will be talking about mindfulness, the scientific evidence for mindfulness.
We'll go one better than that, Ashok. I'll make sure I've got the details, and I'll put them all over my channels as well, because I think that was fantastic. So thanks ever so much once again. Thank you for being on the show.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Ed. Have a lovely day, Scott.
Cheers now. All the best. Bye-bye. Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I thought that was fantastic hour, and there are so many things now bouncing off my mind that I want to talk to Ashok about. There's one book that I would suggest if you're interested in this field. This is a new book by a chap called Stuart Ritchie. He just released this about 6 months ago. Stuart is a Scotsman, but he now works down in one of the London universities. He's a former Edinburgh University guy, and he talks about the scientific method and the issues that Ashok talked about. It's a really good book. So science fictions I would recommend. So, and finally, remember, I'll just put this on the screen so you can see it. Remember that your stories, if you can be an archaeologist of your stories, folks, you can change the world. Just listen to what Ashok was talking about there. There are things that you can use your own stories to talk about complexity, simplicity across the frame. Please think about your own stories, because as I've always said on this show, stories can act as an empathy engine. They can help people understand you better. And if they tell you their story, you can understand them better. And like any engine, it needs maintenance and it needs oiled, but you are the driver. So please think about that going forward. Gather your own stories, and I can't wait to see you again next week. Thanks very, very much for joining Artifact Live with me, Scott McArthur. Thank you very much.